Welcome to Club Damingo, brought to you by Cyclone Comics.
I'm checking internet now.
All good. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2. Hi, Tim. How's it going?
Good morning, Gary. I'm well. How are you?
I'm very well. I've got a little question to ask you. How do we fix the comic industry?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Oh, my God. Really? That's the question for today?
That's the question for today. And it rolls on from a little something that I found when I was reading an old comics journal that had an interview with Roy Crane in it. And inside was a letter of comment from me, which a couple of issues previous, they were talking about this is back in 1998. So the comic industry was in crisis. Wow. It always seems to be in crisis in one way or another.
I was going to say.
So
what a shock.
So this is relevant to American comics in particular, but it also plays out to another conversation on Facebook that was had about Australian comics and what could work for marketing and getting a product together for the Australian market as well. So if you don't mind me just reading out here, the pertinent bits were about editors and their lack of doing their job properly. So this is American comics editors I'm talking about primarily. Editors are not doing their job.
Okay.
To wit, number one, truly bad comics won't sell. Who defines which comics don't cut the mustard? The editor does. Most American comic book editors, it seems, are ex-fanboys or failed creators that don't know how to edit, let alone know the fundamentals of telling a decent story. How the hell would they be able to advise and support any creator they work with? Too many editors operate on a jobs for the boys mentality. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Any comment, Tim?
Any comments so far?
So far, yeah, it's going well, isn't it?
Oh my God! Well, I thought you were going for the jugular there. Well, so what year was this? 1998. Were you? How much? How much work were you getting or hoping to get at the time in the American market? Because you're yelling at all the bosses who may not want to employ you after this.
Well, I think my day in the sun was done by that stage, I think, or I'd reached a point where I didn't give a crap. So, Anyway, I'll keep on reading, shall I?
Yeah, go for it. This is pretty fun.
Point number 2. Good comics don't get pushed hard enough by the publisher. Who has the power to walk down the corridor and liaise with the marketing department? The editor does. The American comic industry does nothing to effectively market any of its product. Indistinguishable house ads don't count. Same with diamond catalogue pictures, they're a given. People can't buy what they don't know is out there.
And are you talking to DC and Marvel editors, or are you talking to like the indie editors as well, like in these points?
The editors that are in the machine of the American comic book industry, so primarily the corporate comic editors, primarily. But that also overlaps. The Venn diagram does overlap with the next level down. The Dark Horses and the Images of the world. And again, this is back in 1998. Not so much now because things have changed. I do believe, particularly at Image for the better. 3. This is a good one. 3. Each comic needs its own format to attract the target market. Who should decide this in consultation with the creator? The editor. Throw out your Mylar snugs. Forget the standard American comic book size. The format can add so much more to a book's appeal. Why limit a project to 4 or 5 bi-monthly or monthly installments of 22 to 24 pages? Comic books should be as in-your-face and exciting kind of art form. Why are they the smallest magazine on the rack besides Reader's Digest? Boom!
Yeah, so you have been pushing this large format thing for a while. You're still seeing your large print Jackaroo on the board back there.
That's right.
Where can you remember off the top of your head when you did the large format newsprint Flash Damingo? What year was that?
I think that was in the early 90s, sometimes in the early 90s. So probably about 5-6 years earlier than this.
Because this has been something that,
yeah,
something that you've been interested in for a while. Yeah, okay, fantastic. I don't know what the timeline is for Mouse Guard, but wasn't Mouse Guard like square format?
I think it was.
Trying to
Yeah,
trying to look like a children's book a little bit more.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, all right, keep going, Charlie.
Uh,
Geez, you
we got 5
got your
points,
teeth into it. Keep going.
and we're up to number 4. Creators should be left to create. Who should have the knowledge to liaise with designers, colorists, production departments, printers, and distributors if required on the creator's behalf? The editor should. True, professional editors are non-existent in Australia due to the scale of most of the comic book operations down here, but the American industry is structured in such a way that an editor, in most cases, is required. The editor should be a jack of all trades and master of none. They are the key to a project's success besides the creative content of the project itself. Onwards.
Yeah.
Point 5.
Yeah.
A sense of professionalism
Can't
and
disagree.
controlled ego is required by all creators. Who should have the experience and skills to guide a new artist or writer through the early stages of professionalism and popularity, or lack thereof, so they do not become unrealistic in their aims and attitudes? The editor. Do the work first, be judged on the work second, let the hype look after itself. Obviously, for self-publishers, the above points may not be too relevant, but I have noticed a distinct lack of these skills in editors over the years. It could only help matters if the people with muscle in the industry use it wisely, but as recent experience has shown, that may be hoping for far too much. So that was an excerpt from my initial letter in the Comics Journal, and that's from 1998.
Yeah.
Doesn't reflect on any sort of current opinions that may have developed over the years. But based on that, Dr. Kevin Patrick got back in touch. I posted this on Facebook and got some interesting thread reactions from different people, and some of them are just absolutely fantastic and worth. I got in touch with Kev this morning to see whether we could read some of his replies, and he was totally cool with it. And I got a couple of replies from Nat Carmichael, which I haven't been in touch with yet, but I assume he'll be okay with it. If not, we'll edit them out. But so Kev writes,
okay.
have you got anything to throw into the mix at this stage, or are you happy just to sit back and listen?
I don't think so. I think you should keep going. This is, a train of thought that we should continue to let run.
Yeah, okay. My initial thoughts were, again, primarily about the American industry, but there is some overlap here, and now we veer back towards Australian comics in particular. Kev writes,
Yep.
A lot of your suggestions really resonated with me. I've always felt that the last remnants of Australia's licensed comics publishers, Yaffa, Page Publications, Federal Comics et al., missed the real opportunity to repackage licensed US reprints for the Australian market in the early to mid-1980s that could have broadened the appeal of comics to a larger, older readership. I think the mistake they made was opting to print cheaply formatted editions of US titles that were nearly identical to the direct American imports that diehard fans could easily obtain from the growing network of specialty shops then operating in most Australian capital cities. He continues, I felt that they could have done worse than emulate the Marvel UK approach and develop anthology titles that could showcase different characters and genres to a more mainstream audience that weren't primarily interested in superheroes. Kev's come across 1980s era surveys of Australian school kids, which indicated that they had largely abandoned superhero comics in favour of humour strips like Garfield or the Australian edition of Mad magazine. Marvel UK did, admittedly, with mixed results, develop anthology titles that grouped a diverse range of strips designed to cater to a specific readership or interest group. Valor, for example, focused mainly on sword and sorcery titles. Future Tense collected sci-fi and fantasy stories in direct competition with 2000 AD, and Forces in Combat dealt largely with war strips. The weekly serial format wasn't really compatible with Marvel Comics' monthly episodic format, but this was a genuine attempt to repackage foreign comics in ways that appeal to entrenched British publishing traditions and readers' preferences for weekly comics. KG Murray Publishers were far more consistent in this approach with their non-superhero titles like Fastest Gun Western, Weird Tales et al., which might explain why these latter titles had a comparatively longer shelf life than many of their superhero titles at this point, late 1970s, early 1980s, which is an interesting time period because, this is Gary speaking now, because that was pre-Cyclone and in that very quiet late 70s era where those black and white reprints were dominant on the newsstands. Okay, back to Kev. I always felt that the Swedish comics model of the 1970s, 1980s, which blended old and new American, British and European strips, carefully selected by editors who strive to give their titles a distinct look and feel, could have worked equally well in Australia, and a more exotic cosmopolitan lineup, great comic stories from around the world, would have given them a real point of difference from imported American comics. Finally, in this reply, Kev goes on to say, as an example, as one Swedish reader of Fantomen, the Swedish edition of the Phantom, pointed out to me, it wasn't uncommon for Fantomen readers to buy the magazine for the supporting features rather than for the headline Swedish-drawn Fantomen stories. Although the Swedish comics market has contracted over the last few decades, this multi-story anthology format is still the predominant model and still serves loyal readership month after month. The Swedish edition of X9, featuring adventure espionage strips like Modesty Blaze, is, in Kev's opinion, a viable template for the kind of superhero-free comic that could be published here in Australia. The imported content could be rounded out by Australian-drawn features, and the covers could be drawn by Australian artists, which would undoubtedly appeal to the growing market for foreign variant covers and the editions of US comics. The French Marvel Comics reprint anthology Strange is a good example of this format. I don't know if this approach is viable now in the 2020s, which is a vastly different media environment to the one you were writing about in the late 1990s, but I can't help but think there is a place for a regular comics magazine sold through mainstream outlets rather than comic shops, so he's including bookstores and libraries, etc., that could attract older readers, i.e. not kids, who aren't averse to reading comics, but don't want to fork out upwards of $30 for a single graphic novel. So that was his first reply, which I thought was absolutely fantastic, but his follow-up is even more interesting. But anything to add to that mix at this point?
No, keep going.
This next one isn't as long, so I'm apologising for my boring reading, but I'm trying to make it as the content that's interesting, so bear with it. This topic, this is Kev writing again, this topic has been a long-standing preoccupation with me for years, especially since my short-lived stint as publisher of The Panther back in 2001-2002. I know the domestic Australian comics and magazine market has changed enormously since then, even more profoundly than the changes which confronted Australia's last surviving commercial comics publishers back in the mid-1980s. Since living in the US since 2016, I've had more exposure to foreign language comics, especially Mexican and Spanish language comics, which circulate widely there. And it's been a real eye-opener seeing how other countries, such as Mexico, were able to counteract the huge influx of translated American comics and other Spanish language comics from neighbouring South American countries with their own unique comics, traditions, genres and formats. Admittedly, Mexico can draw from a long tradition of indigenous mythologies and storytelling traditions that inspire so many contemporary comics in ways that Anglophile nations like Australia or New Zealand cannot. Let me just get my marker here. I'm in the middle of a dense paragraph. He continues, I'm not suggesting that Mexican comics industry practices are automatically applicable to the Australian context, but they offer an insightful example of how to economically, culturally, I'll try that again. I'm not suggesting that Mexican comic industry practices are automatically applicable to the Australian context, but they offer an insightful example of how an economically, culturally subordinate nation living in the shadow of American mass culture can produce comics that resonate with domestic audiences in ways that imported comics, no matter their country of origin, simply cannot achieve. I don't know if this is true of other Latin American nations. The Mexican publishers produce comics in a wide variety of formats. I've got examples that literally fit in the palm of my hand and price points that make them accessible to even the poorest reader. Hence, I agree with the point that you made in your TCJ letter that American publishers, as well as other Anglosphere nations, should no longer remain wedded to the standard US floppy magazine format and experiment with different packages that best suit any given comics project. For example, I thought the 1980s era budget book reprints of US-UK comic strips like The Phantom, Flash Gordon, Garth, and Mandrake the Magician, published in oblong landscape format, showed off the daily newspaper episodes to good effect. Despite all these caveats, I think Australian publishers could learn from the history and practices of foreign comic publishers in ways that might appeal to a new generation of as yet untapped readers. So that was his input. He does have one short reply to Nat Carmichael. So Nat actually replied by saying, I concur that there remains a place for regular local Australian comic magazine. The problem remains where to market it. Local comic shops remain uninterested, although they once were they were the go-to for local fanzines published in the 80s, and newsagents are shrinking in number. Frew, by placing more Aussie content within their pages, have proved that there remains an audience, and I'm assuming here that it's viable. And Kev replies to Nat, local comic shops have been historically reluctant to stock Australian-drawn comics or Australian comic fanzines, although that trend has thankfully changed. And I know that forward-thinking retailers like All Star Comics Melbourne, to use but one example, are active supporters and stockists for Australian comics. But the total number of Australian comic shops is minuscule and not enough to support a commercially viable Australian published comic magazine, regardless of whether it reprints foreign content, locally drawn material, or a mixture of both. Newsagents are still a leading sales outlet for magazines of all descriptions, even though their numbers are declining. I would argue that specialist newsagents that exclusively service airports and large capital railway stations, such as Newslinks and WH Smiths, respectively, are an untapped distribution network. Supermarkets are another viable magazine sales outlet and would seem a welcoming environment to more kid-friendly titles, especially if promoted as impulse buys for parents who want something to entertain young children. And to end all of this, Nat replies, Kevin, seeking to have magazines, specifically Oi Oi Oi, which Nat published through Comic Oz, retailed at airports and retail outlets like Woolworths was a costly exercise. Distributors, and just remember, I'm speaking from an experience from 10 years ago now, expected print runs of over 10,000 copies per issue before they contemplated retailing them in that environment. With sales not even covering the costs of even the printing, it was an option that I had to dismiss, despite the increased visibility for the comic and the increased potential sales traffic. So that's what I've copied and pasted from the thread that was really interesting.
Wow.
And that tilts right around to, I still think that as far as local comic shops and bookstores, there needs to be a central distribution point or catalogue for retailers and bookstores to be able to order from, so that all the disparate Australian comic publishers and ideas, if they want to be marketed to that area, should be in a catalogue. And I've heard that you've had experience in this by trying that exact same idea years ago. So I wanted to bring that all around to you and rest my throat a little bit by throwing it to you, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your distribution experience and your thoughts on anything else that was read out.
Okay. So we are going to go back to what you just read out, right? If I talk about Sunburnt Comics distribution, we'll come back to what you were just reading, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I made notes while you were talking. There's a lot in there. And I apologize that I hadn't read it. I forget what morning it came up in my feed, and I just didn't have time to read it at that point. So this is all fresh to me, dear listener. I hadn't actually read any of this. So I can see, I brought it up on my screen as well. I can see that there is commentary from a few other people. So I will go through it afterwards. I'm kind of interested. But I'm a little bit surprised at you, Gary, and in that really I feel like our recent discussions, you and I, personally and probably on the podcast here, have been our job, which you mentioned in your letter to the Comics Journal. Our job is to make the comics and forget about everything else, maybe for now. And I know it's not our only job, because like you say in that letter, we are independent creators, which means we have to do everything. But I'm kind of, so speaking very personally, I would much rather see more pages from Gary Chaloner than have Gary Chaloner try to fix the Australian, let alone the international comics issue, right? The comics problems. I want to see more pages more often. That's what I want to see. And I'm pretty sure you've agreed with me on that a few times. And that's all I want to do as well. I just want to make the book. I don't want to have to think about any of this, which is part of the reason why, again, in our discussions previously, I've been saying, I just want to get back onto the Diamond, and I know Diamond might not exist anymore, but I just want to get back on the Diamond train there, or whatever it might be, and just get my comics through the distribution system, and just see what happens with that. So you brought. Did you want to say anything before I go on?
You can't.
Having a crack at you.
You got to. That's just such a a random thing to say. Just want to get my comics out there without whatever system is out there. I'll just.
It's not random at all when you and I are talking. This is the crux of everything, right? We want to make them and get them read. That's the crux of everything. All of that stuff that you just read out. We want to make 100%, them and get them in. Yeah.
Yeah, hung die. We are hung die. We are in agreement on that 100%. But this other subject overlays it like a big wet doona that you still have to contend with. and the dog has done a wee in the wet doona, and you're still very cold and you can't throw it off. So yeah. let's talk with it about it. In the understanding that yes, drawing comics and telling stories is the number one primary reason for getting out of bed in the morning, out from under the wet doona.
With that in mind, let's continue. So you mentioned Sunburnt Comics distribution, which I spearheaded for a number of years. I probably should have brought up the files before we got online so I could have more exact data. But about three or 4 years, I think I did it. And it started off as a co-op to distribute our comics to Australian comic shops. So and this was when Greener Pastures was about issue 4, something like that, issue 4 or 5. So mid 90s, coming to mid to late 90s, and the co-op was between because I came up with the idea, and I just wanted to bring people around me that already knew and trusted. So the co-op was us, me and Michael for Greener Pastures, Mark and John for Bug and Stump, and Trudy and Doug for Platinum Grit. So the other reason why it was those three is that Platinum Grit was Brisbane-based, Bug and Stump were Melbourne-based, and we were Sydney-based. So we would have a base in 3 of the large cities. And the idea was that we would each be a distribution hub, in that each of us would have each other's comics to distribute on behalf of all 3 of us. So I put together a catalogue, and it was just an A4 catalogue, an A5 catalogue, printed out on a laser printer and then stapled, and then because it was basically pre-internet, mailed out to all of the comic shops in Australia. And it was really like a really like shrunk down version of the Diamond catalog. It really was. We had a cover feature, I had a little editorial, and then we had a page for every new item that had come out between this catalog and the last catalog. And then in the back, we had all the back issues that were available, and there was a wholesale price listed, and the cover price, and all of that kind of stuff.
Sweet, perfect.
So it was, and it was, it absolutely, and it did work. It absolutely worked. Again, if when you start talking again, I might go searching for the files, because I made some lists at one point, and we sold, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of dollars worth of Australian comics, every catalog, right? Not over the period, like every catalog. And no doubt, if you said you have to put a number on it, I would say Platinum Grit were probably, if not half, nearly half of all of that, because they were so rightly so popular. But it meant that that there was there was an appetite. There was an appetite for Australian comics, and if you make it easy enough for the comic shops to buy them, and that was the idea, as easy as possible. Here's the order form on the back page. Here's the phone number to fax it to. Gosh, that's how long ago this was. And we would just get the stuff in, and we would send the stuff that we would get the orders in, and we would send the stock out before even getting paid. We were just trusting that they would pay us, but most of them paid pretty much immediately, usually by check in the mail. Again, because that was the time period. We did a few shops on sale or return, on consignment. And that was problematic because they almost never paid, and how do we know how many they haven't sold? And when we did kind of wind up, most of them didn't end up giving us the money for the stock that they had, and didn't give us back the stock that they had. So I still carry those scars now. I won't deal with anybody on consignment. They either buy the comic and have faith that they can sell it, or don't buy it from me. So that ran for 10 catalogs over about 3 or 4 years.
How did I miss out on this completely? I mean, this was at a time where I think I was over in WA, and that might be why. But it just
could be.
Went past my radar completely. So it must have just been.
So you didn't know? You didn't know about it
at the time? I think I may have heard about it, but it wasn't affecting my life to the point where I got in touch or participated in any way, shape, or form. And then recently, I've only heard it. as a historical
I was going to say,
backstory of Tim used to do that, or was part of that.
I keep on trying to tell people that I did it because people think it's like that they. Anyway, I'll get onto that in a second. So B, were you actually producing at the time? So because maybe you weren't. Maybe that was in a fallow period for you.
Yeah, maybe.
Because the other slightly problematic part of it was that I was very gatekeep, because I was going to say, by the time we did our second catalog, my control freak aspects let Doug and Trudy and Mark and John off the hook and said, I'm just doing the whole thing, just forget it, I'll do the whole thing. I think it was more trouble than it was worth to try to organize all of us than to just do it myself. And my God, when I say myself, I mean me and Anne-Marie, because Anne-Marie would sit on the floor packaging up boxes and stuff as often as I would. So as often happens, we don't get through any of this without our partners. So what was I about to say? Oh yeah, I was definitely gatekeeping as well, and started off very small with basically just the three publishers, Greener Pastures, Platinum Grit, Bug and Stump. And then we were only inviting in other publishers as I saw being likely to of a high enough quality to be welcomed by both the shops and the readers. And I know that is a very, like, who am I to be making those decisions? But somebody has to. It's kind of like what you were reading out in the comics journal there. Somebody has to make those marketing decisions, right?
Yeah.
If I made it open slather and just said everybody into the catalog, then all of a sudden it's like the comic shops lose faith in what they're buying. And so I was introducing new people very slowly. And I drew an arbitrary line in the sand and didn't involve mini comics, as we called them back then. I think people would probably call them zines now. But I was getting to the point, if we had kept going, where I would either have a flip catalog or a second catalog or just another section in the catalog for the zines, because I mean, half of my probably more than half of my Australian comic collection is zines, mini comics, etc., because they're so amazing. But yeah, that was a line that we drew. So it was a simple system. Here's the catalog. Send back your form, and if we didn't get it back, I would spend one day a week just ringing them all, saying, "Have you got it? What's your order?" Write it down. Send the stuff out. So yeah, it worked really well. But just like the problem with it was, people often ask why Greener Pastures kind of paused at around issue 7. And Sunburnt Comics distribution was a major reason for that, because any time I had was spent doing that rather than doing my comics. So it comes back to the whole thing I just said a minute ago, is we need to make the comics and we want them in front of people, but I don't know that we're the right people to do that anymore. And one of my notes, or anymore, I don't think we were the right people to do that ever. And one of my notes that I wrote down while you were reading was, which I've been saying for years, and a lot of people say, it's not just me, is that this sort of stuff needs to be done. Publishing, distribution, marketing really needs to be done by a non-creator. Let the creators create, and somebody else does all the other stuff, just like you said in your letter to the TCJ. So that, and I'm living proof that there'd probably have been another 3 issues maybe during that period, maybe 6 issues during that period, if I wasn't also trying to distribute everybody's comic, including my own. Right. So that's the brief, I guess, history of Sunburnt Comics distribution. Yeah. It was successful, but time consuming. I wish somebody else could have taken it over.
Yeah. Well, and is it a good idea for the current scene, bearing in mind that you could also weave the conversation around, are newsagents relevant at all anymore? And if you were to set up a distribution catalog and central point by a non-creator, would that person just be operating with comic shops and bookstores and libraries, and you'd leave the news agency side of things to the pages of history?
Yeah. I don't think newsagents are viable in the slightest. I think people go to the newsagents to buy the Phantom, just like they go to the newsagents to buy New Idea, because that's the only place to get it. I don't know, Phantom's probably available in the comic shops, etc. But you know what I mean? Like people who don't buy comics buy the Phantom, and people who don't buy comics buy the newspaper and buy New Idea, right? The Phantom's main readership, and I'm sure that I'm kicking another hornet's nest now. Phantom readers, I think, by and large, are not necessarily comics readers. Yes, they enjoy the comic medium, but only because the Phantom is presented in that manner. I back in the day, we used to have this conversation at OzCon. People would, or at zine fairs, or I don't know where, I can't, and people would say, I don't read comics. And they go, oh, don't you? And they say, yeah, I read the Phantom, but I don't read comics. Like that would be the actual quote out of people's mouths, that they would say, I don't read comics, but you read the Phantom. Oh yeah, I read that. So that, I think that's still a common mindset for people in regards to the Phantom. I think newsagents, that ship has sailed. And it was really interesting. Let me go on about some of the things that I made notes about. You were talking about Murray Publishing and Yaffa Publishing. I forget who else, like the black and white Australian reprints of the 70s, 80s, 90s. Started to be in color as well. And I totally get it, what Kevin was saying about how they were trying to look exactly like American comics by the end, because they were printing in color. And I think Murray or Yaffa actually had like the DC logo on the cover, right near the end. And I was like, well, I don't want to buy this. I like the fact that you were printing it slightly larger and in black and white, because I can go to King's Comics or Comic Kingdom and buy a better printed version than what you've got here. So yeah, they were definitely shooting themselves in the foot there. I think they thought they were doing a better job, but I think they were doing a worse job. But the point I was about to say was that I'm pretty sure that all of those publishers, and this is just my vague knowledge of Australian comics history in regards to that, they were just publishing comics to use up the leftover paper on the rolls and to keep them at the offset printing machines running, because every hour that they're down actually costs 2 or 3 hours because of cleanup and warming them back up again.
Exactly.
So they'd rather just keep the machines running. And one of the things we learned when we were doing newsagent distribution was that the distributor, Gordon and Gotch, were the comics and in mags, Playboy, Penthouse, and the B, C, D, E grade versions of those kind of magazines were looked at in the same way, which was, we have this much shelf space to fill in a newsagent. We fill it with the stuff that sells, and whatever is left over, it's full of porn mags and comics. So they had a ready market in that regard, the comic books did, in that there was space for them, because Gordon and Gotch wanted to fill up the empty space on newsagent shelves, but they didn't care. Gordon and Gotch didn't care. I haven't never spoken to Yaffa or Murray or anyone who worked there, but as far as I can tell, they didn't care. They were just printing what they had a license to print to fill up shelf space and to keep the machines running. So I think Kev is giving a little bit too much to those publishers when he says, I think that they were took a misstep. I don't think they cared at all, and when it wasn't working anymore, they were probably going, well, thank God we don't have to think about comics anymore, because what a waste of time they were.
I don't think Yaffa employed an editor in any way, shape or form. It would be a case of the night shift and the day art guys putting some bromides together and chucking it on the night shift, and that'd be about it. And
when somebody said, we've actually got too many pages of this American comic, you want us to print 4 issues of Teen Titans in this month's version of Australian Teen Titans, but we've got too many pages, and they'd say, well, just turn them sideways and print them smaller, or chop that one up and take out the panels that don't fit, or
print them on the inside back cover and back cover.
Yeah, that's right, the outside back cover. That being said, right, there is, I think I've said this online somewhere, there is no bigger trigger for nostalgia for me than picking up a Newton comic that I've never seen before, or pulling mine out of my boxes. those Newton comics were pretty much my introduction to comics. And then the black and white ones from Yaffa, where they print, for example, Fantastic Four 196 and 197, and Fantastic Four number 15 in the back. Like, that was like mind blowing to get Keith Pollard, Joe Sinnott stuff in the front, and then Jack Kirby, Dick Ayers stuff in the back. It was like amazing. So I really love them. It's incredible that they didn't care, because they looked amazing. I loved reading them in black and white. I loved coloring most of them in as well, which is unfortunate. They'd probably be worth a bit of money as a collectible now if they weren't colored in and textured by me. But anyway.
And the Marvel value stamp clipped out.
Yeah, in the Newton ones. Oh, I had the posters all over my walls for years. None of mine have got the posters in them.
I think that was the gateway drug for the early Marvels. Like, you could get the modern stuff, the 1970s stuff that was being released at the same time, and the 80s. All that stuff you could get in the comic shops or on the newsstands, but Newton's in particular, and some of the Yaffa and Federal Publishing stuff, gave you access to the Jack Kirby material from 10 years, 15 years previous, and that was what the gold was.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So interesting. So what else have I got here? I do. It is interesting what Kev said about how the UK handled this and made those anthologies, but they had an absolute cultural thing happening already that they were just mimicking via everything else that they'd ever published, in comics. They were all anthologies, they were all weeklies.
They also had a production office and editors and production staff to actually do a cohesive UK creature that was specific to the market.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. What else have I got here? And because I just mentioned the word culture there, right? The UK had this culture of anthology, weekly anthologies, etc. Because Kevin Patrick,
let's do.
You can edit that bit out. Kevin bloody Patrick. Kevin.
That's staying in. That is staying in.
I was going to say, I fear that's not going to get edited out. Sorry, Kevin. Kevin Patrick, mentioned the word culture, and then also was talking about what he's seen with the Mexican and Latino language comics. Well, this has been our problem forever, right? In English-speaking countries, is that we just don't have a chance to create our own cultural being in the same regard as countries who have their own language, right? And yes, a country that does not have English as their first language is likely to have Marvel and DC reprints, but they're also very likely to have a very healthy set of their own historically successful work. And I can't fight that. So I just don't think that's a relevant argument to put forward, because we are in Australia where it is English. And one of my notes here is America, because you said you were reading and it says one of the terms you used was American mass culture. And I wrote, American mass culture is our culture. And I know it's not 100%, but it's definitely more and more as every decade goes by in Australia, that American mass culture becomes much more ingrained in Australia. We used to, and I think New Zealand probably holds on to this a little bit better than we do, but we used to be this really cool middle ground between UK mass culture and American mass culture, creating our own, with our own national culture, would create something really interesting and unique. And it feels like it's really being swamped now with probably the advent of the internet. That's again, I think a huge problem. It's all of this stuff, right? All of this stuff is part of the reason why. Let me think. What am I trying to say here? That like I've been a huge proponent of the Australian comics community and tried to build that in, a billion different ways from the first time I was ever involved with it. And it's the reason why I'm really trying to step back from that as much as possible now. I want to be involved in the Australian comics community, but I can't be the person who continues to push, to organize and to push and to spend all the time on it. I've got my comics to draw, and I've probably lost 2 decades worth of drawing time trying to do it, and I feel like you're in a similar boat. So yeah, I look to people who are fans of Australian comics and say, can you please be the person who will take this on? And you bring up Sunburnt Comics distribution, and I've had, I reckon, at least 3, I'm trying to remember if it was 3 or 4 serious conversations with people who say, you did this thing, right? Can you tell me how you did it? Because I'm going to do it. And then they don't do it. And I spent hours telling them how it worked and giving them all the files. And, it's everybody has their heart in the right place, but it's you need somebody who's willing to really dig in for 5 years to see if it's going to work at what kind of capacity.
And the landscape can change so much in 5 years. You start out trying to do one thing, and by the end of 5 years, even things like COVID, all that kind of decision or things that affect your decision-making processes have been known to happen. And just, Just to throw in your talking about cultural comics and things like that, just there is an effort by Indigiverse to take advantage or exploit that side of things culturally in the Australian black culture, introducing it to whites in a superhero context. So there is that, and there have been always efforts along those lines, but nothing is as well coordinated as the Indigiverse is trying to do. So that's mentioning.
That's incredibly, it's incredibly exciting because they took a. I think they've started off nice and slow, but they're really kind of trying to change gears now. Very important, and it's great. I'm so excited to see that that's happening. Really keen for it to be successful. So yeah. Do you want to know what my big plan was at one point? And I'm happy for somebody to take this and run with it as long as you give me 1% of profits when it's profitable. And that was when I really got into Will Eisner, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. As in, I've always been interested in Eisner for like probably 25 or 30 years. But I started to read about his history and really having a good look at what his, what the history of the Spirit was, and the fact that it was a comic insert. And it was a comic book in the Sunday paper. Most of our listeners some of our listeners may be too young to remember the comic section, the big pull-out comic section of the Sunday paper, which I lived for from week to week. And instead of doing that, right, he had an actual comic book in there with the front cover being the Spirit and 2 other. And I went, that idea still has legs. And I've got in, I think it's in the bottom of the cupboard here, a huge box full of all of my material where I put together some mock-ups for a free, probably aimed at kids, but not little kids magazine for the Sunday paper. And I did all of the sums where if you get this much advertising at the kind of rates that K-Zone and the other kids magazines, I forget what they're called now, the rates that they were getting for advertising, you get this many pages of ads at this kind of rate. This is how much money it's going to cost. I got the quotes from the printers and blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is hugely profitable, right? And all the artists get paid, the editor gets paid, the newspaper gets paid. And I went to both newspapers and they wouldn't even talk to me. Like they're going,
but
comics are on the way out.
There's your problem now as newspapers are becoming irrelevant.
Yeah, but I was trying to say, but you remember the old days when if, let's say, Ginger Meggs was in one paper and then went to the other one, you would get 100 million people travel with it, right? So here is your next big thing to say, you really should come back to the Sunday Telegraph because the kids are going to love this, and it's free with the Sunday Telegraph.
Yeah.
And this was back in the time when they were putting in books and magazines and stuff in the Sunday paper.
Yeah.
I haven't bought a Sunday paper for probably a decade myself, but and it looked amazing. It would have been great, and it was free. And it's just kind of, again, it's not necessarily all my big idea. I just put in the sweat, because back in the mid 90s, I think that would be the period when issue 1 comics was happening. That was the next step for issue 1 for Sam Young, Stuart Hale, etc. With issue 1 comics was trying to do an on the street, free weekly rags sort of comic, and they had mock-ups, and they were selling advertising to reasonably big advertisers like Coca-Cola, etc. And it was this close to happening. I don't know what the backstory is for why it didn't happen, but that seems to be, for Australia, the only way that we can figure out how to pay us for making comics is to have it for free, but have the advertising pay for it.
Yeah, interesting. Do you remember the old tabloid Tracks magazine, the surf newspaper, that had the original Captain Good Vibes in the back as well? Love that. Tabloid stuff was quite popular back in the 70s and early 80s, or 60s and 70s, and it's sort of like diminished. It is the cheapest kind of web press publishing you can get out there. I've been tossing around the idea of talking to a Tasmanian news press publisher just down the road that I used to work for, just to do the Flash Damingo or Jackaroo as tabloid again. But the trim size of their tabloid is incorrect for comics, and I didn't want to go down that pathway again of becoming a over-the-counter publisher to that extent. But it's never been too far from the mind to do the tabloid newspaper format. But as you say, it has its faults.
Sorry,
and
I think
I suppose
that were all of my notes.
Yeah, and this is only pertaining to a certain section of popular mainstream US style comics as well, I suppose. Like the mainstream of what people are used to from the 70s and 80s. It's sort of Australian comics have changed heaps over the last 20 years, 25 years. There's more Instagram comics and webtoon comics and zines and things like the ideas that are pitched to Allen and Unwin and mainstream publishers now. There are different ways that are not just newsstand distribution points anymore. So things have changed. And so what we've been talking about today was basically relevant to Phantom style comics and newsstand distribution in general, not to the different opportunities that are available these days.
We're definitely still talking like old men talking about print all the time. Because probably the most successful, at least the most successful young cartoonists, comic book artists in this country are the ones who have got hundreds of thousands of followers on either Instagram and or Webtoons or a Webtoons like site. People that I don't even know of. I go, really? Is that like they've got 3 different series running on there and they're up to, installment number 300, and it's like, well, really? And I've never heard of this. It's incredible. The more power to them.
Yeah, and that plays to what I was saying the other week about being at the Paper Cuts Market Day and just looking around the town hall, which is absolutely packed with all these people that were just doing their thing, and it just had very little to do with what my conception of a comic was, and it was very eye-opening. For me, it was absolutely fantastic, and if that's being replicated in every single festival around the country, that's things have changed a lot since I was pushing hard back in the 80s. Which is very healthy.
Interesting. I think so, for sure. Absolutely.
But I still think, despite Sunburnt, was it? What was the name of your distribution idea? Sunburnt. There's still a place for a non-creator to fill that void with a distribution point to make it easier for creators to access comic shops and bookstores and libraries. I think that's something that I still have to be argued against. Since how you say that you were quite successful, it was just man hours that really torpedoed the idea. Would that be correct to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just seeing if I can find it now. And we did it not for profit. because
Right.
I'm an idiot like that. So it was all not for profit. And if I had asked for a cut, I can't see any of the comic book people who were associated saying, no, I'm not going to give you a cut. They were all so grateful for the service, because they didn't have to do anything. They just had to give me some data, once a catalog to put in the catalog, and then send me the stock, and I would just take the stock, right? So yeah, everybody was very grateful. And maybe if I had actually asked for some money, to ask for a cut, maybe we would have kept going for a little while longer.
Right.
But yeah.
While you're hunting around
I've got some data here.
Oh,
I've just
okay.
brought up
Yeah,
this
cool.
one point back in the message board days of the internet. Somebody said something about Australian comics, and I went, fuck this. You stop telling these things that are based without any
Receipts.
data whatsoever.
Yes.
Yeah. So I one of the things I wrote back was a single catalog of Sunburnt Comics distribution sold $6,500 worth of comics. That was one catalog. And don't forget, our comics were like $3. So $6,500 worth. It was 1,700 comics from a single catalog.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And we did 11 catalogs over 4 years, 300 separate orders over those 4 years, 300 orders over 4 years. That's how many times we packaged up, Anne-Marie and I packaged something up to send out, 300 times. So that data, and I know, again, this is like late 90s, and that's like a lifetime ago now, but that data shows that there was something in it for everybody, the creator, and the comic shop and the reader. There was something in it for everybody. So yeah.
Wow, lots to think about. But anyway, it shouldn't stop us from drawing the next page.
Absolutely. Draw the next page, and somebody else will maybe figure out how to get it in front of your readers.
Did you want to quickly mention the Aurealis Awards?
Yeah, I was going to say that, because otherwise, time will get away and we won't ever mention it. So the Aurealis Awards were on over the weekend, Saturday night, I believe. And if you haven't heard of the Aurealis Awards, then it's mostly sci-fi, fantasy, horror kind of books, mostly books and short stories, prose mostly. But they have a best graphic novel / illustrated work section as well. And not to keep you in suspense, Chris Gooch's In Utero won this year, which I thought was an absolute well-deserved win. I read that twice. I liked it so much. It's a really good book. But the other books that were listed, Tank Book 3, I'm just reading this off the internet. The Star Tide Shores, which I haven't read. I've read Action Tank Book 1, and I've got the other two because I enjoyed it so much. I bought the other two. The Star Tide Shores I haven't read yet, and I'm hoping to see that at a convention or a fair one day soon. And it's by Harry Goldner. And when it says by Harry, I think there was more than just Harry involved. There's a team there. So I'm keen to see that, the Star Tide Shores. In Utero by Chris Gooch, Your Highness by Ennis Kane and Chris Pitcairn, which again I haven't read yet. So it's Nicole Kane, and I should bring that to the top of my reading list. The Sweetness Between Us by Sarah Winifred Searle from Perth. Which I don't have a copy of yet, but I should get a copy of that. That's it's published by Alan Unwin, and Tom Taylor and Nicola Scott. So two Aussie Titans. They're doing Titans for DC Comics. So the collected Titans Out of the Shadows.
I see what you did
collected
there.
Trade paperback. Yeah. So yeah, Action Tank, The Star Tide Shores, In Utero, Your Highness, The Sweetness Between Us, Out of the Shadows. Why do we have awards? We have awards to shine a light on stuff that, in the eyes of those judges, is good work, so that hopefully more people will read it. So that list, you should try them. And why do we go to comic fairs and festivals? So that we can see all the stuff that never gets looked at by said judging panels, and find the really interesting stuff there as well.
Yep. Agreed. All good. Is that enough for this week?
I'm spent.
Yeah.
Mr.
Well,
Chaloner.
I want to underline everything by saying that there's no need for answers to any of these problems, but the conversation is important. That's all I'm saying. That everything that we talk about, comics and how they're marketed and released, and how they're drawn.
There is a need for an answer, Gary.
No, I think the discussions may reveal answers, but anyway.
True.
Yeah.
No, I get what you mean. We've definitely got to keep discussing it and see if something might come of it.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's enough. I need a cup of tea, a refresher. So I'll stop recording.
You're somebody that keeps the tea bag in the cup the whole time.
Yeah, because I'll
man.
chew on this for a while now and suck it completely dry.
Oh man, what are you drinking there? Is that
that's an Earl Grey.
An Earl Grey.
That's an Earl Grey.
Nice. Very nice.
Yes.
Cool.
Okay, I'm pressing stop. Talk to you next week.
Bye.